Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Fred Rocco, a former director of the club, and we're very pleased today to have Professor Peter Bradford speak on nuclear-related issues. Professor Bradford is a former member of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and was a member of that panel, I think, when the 3 Mile Island occurred in 1979. He's a graduate and former teacher of Yale University and currently teaches at Vermont Law School on nuclear power and public policy, mainly about the economics of nuclear energy. He will try and address all your questions and issues today, so please welcome. Before that, can you turn off your mobile phones or set them to stun? So please welcome Professor Peter Bradford.
Thanks very much, Fred. I'm very flattered to see such a full room and a large audience, and I'm worried that there may be a misunderstanding. I don't look good on figure skates. I have no Olympic story to tell, and to anyone with those expectations should perhaps leave now. I thought I would talk about two aspects of the U.S. experience with nuclear energy, and I don't want to be understood as thinking that I know what Japan should do, but I can at least lay out the parts of our safety experience after the 3 Mile Island accident and part of the way in which that accident caused our thinking about nuclear power's place in our power supply to change. And then we could use the questions and answers to fit that background as best we can. What you'd like to ask about the situation in Japan. So the 3 Mile Island accident was not comparable to Fukushima. It was a much less significant accident. One reactor's core was destroyed, and for a period of 5 or 6 days it seemed like a very dangerous condition. Then it came under control. Some radiation was released, but nothing like what you've seen at Fukushima. But it was the worst accident in a civilian power reactor anywhere in the world up until that time. So it was a cause for major concern to the U.S. regulatory system and the federal government, which regulates nuclear power in the U.S. And there was a presidential commission formed to investigate the accident. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission set up its own independent investigatory group. The Congress did an investigation. Several of these groups had subpoena power. They prepared extensive reports. U.S. reactors of the 3 Mile Island type were shut down for a period of about 6 months. The companion reactor on the site was shut down for 5 years. The other reactors in the country continued to operate, so that was a different situation than the one in Japan. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission suspended all of its licensing activity for a period of about 2 years while it prepared a full report on the lessons that it considered needed to be learned and the schedule on which they needed to be applied to the operating plants in the U.S. And not only were all of those reports made public, but all of the backup relation to the reports was made public also. So, for example, all of the interviews that the Presidential Commission undertook in preparing its report were available. All of the data from the power plant itself in terms of radiation releases, in terms of what went on in the control room and in the power reactor instrumentation, that was all released. Interviews with the governor of the state of Pennsylvania and his decision-making with regard to evacuation all became public. Interestingly enough, under the U.S. Sunshine Law, any commission, like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, meetings are considered to be public if at least 3 commissioners are involved. So during the accident, during the basically 5 or 6 days of the accident, every time 3 of the NRC commissioners gathered together to talk about it, even if it was quite informal in one or another of our offices, someone from the commission staff was always present with a tape recorder to the high technology tape recorders of 1979. It wasn't as though we had iPhones, but they made a record of these discussions. And within 2 or 3 weeks, those records were typed up, transcribed, released to the general public. And they were in some ways embarrassing. I mean, there was a lot that we didn't know during the accident, and certainly to the extent the public thought that this was a carefully controlled, technologically masterful industry, that sense was shaken up by these transcripts. But they were important in another sense too, and that was that they showed that we weren't sitting around conspiring to cover up the seriousness of the event, that we were, as best we could, grappling with the same uncertainties that the public and a number of other officials at other levels of government had. And in that sense, I think it probably was helpful both to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the credibility of nuclear energy. I'm spending a little more time on this than I probably should in terms of the time we have available, just because of the nature of this group. I think transparency is a difficult issue in Japan, and I think the likelihood that you would ever see transcripts, say, of the TEPCO discussions with the predecessor of the Nuclear Regulatory Authority is probably pretty low. But I am suggesting that that kind of transparency, even when it's a bit embarrassing, it has a strong plus side as long as the officials involved are behaving in good faith. There were a lot of lessons learned as a result of the accident at 3 Mile. They were applied in stages to the nuclear power plants. But the undertaking that we faced after that accident is really not remotely comparable to the challenges that confront the Nuclear Regulatory Authority in Japan today. I mean, that agency is trying to do simultaneously 3 things, any one of which is more or less unique in the history of nuclear regulation in the world. First, it's trying from scratch to create itself. It didn't exist at the time of the Fukushima accident. It was created especially to produce a change in regulatory direction. And that alone is a big job for a new regulatory agency. The U.S. went through it back in the mid-1970s, not as a result of an accident, but as a result of our Congress getting fed up with the promotional activities of an entity called the Atomic Energy Commission. And they concluded then that nuclear regulation had to be independent. But when that agency was set up, it wasn't in the crisis atmosphere that exists around nuclear energy in Japan today. The second unique job is the review of the 50 reactors that are shut down. No other country has ever undertaken a task like that with regard to its entire reactor fleet. And it's important to understand just how difficult it is to review a group of reactors that large, some of which are 40 years old, some of which are much newer, against a newer, higher set of standards. Because it's not as though the country decided that people on the highways were driving too fast, and so there was going to be better highway speed limit enforcement. That kind of thing you can do fairly quickly. But nuclear safety involves understanding, among other things, the equipment that's in the plant and how it measures up to the standards that you want to apply. And as the standards go up, you've got to be able to review what's in the plants. But if the old regulatory system didn't require good record keeping, if the utilities of 40 years ago didn't keep good data on the seismic qualifications, the fire protection, the ability to withstand accident conditions, then trying to figure out how that old equipment measures up to new standards is very, very difficult. And entities that are saying the NRC is going too slowly or dragging its feet really need to think again about the nature of the challenge that it confronts and about the credibility issues that they'll create if they insist that it make its decisions before it's good and ready and satisfied that it's done an adequate review job. And then the third unique job, again, something no regulatory agency's ever had to do, is manage the accident at Fukushima, which, as I said, managing the accident at 3 Mile Island took us the better part of 2 years. And that was one reactor with the radiation largely contained and coolable within a configuration in which the water could be recycled. The water from the hills wasn't running through the plant into an ocean. So what the NRA is dealing with is a reactor, a combination of reactors that, of course, no one would license a configuration like that. They're starting out with a thoroughly unsatisfactory situation and having to make up the regulatory framework as they go along. It's not an operating license anymore. It's a license mess, and that's something that nuclear regulators just aren't used to having to deal with. You can't train people on simulators for conditions that were never simulatable. So the combination of events that the NRA is facing, something that I can understand and put in a framework of my own experience with 3 Mile Island, but it's not, it goes way beyond anything that any regulatory agency in the world has real experience with. Now let me shift gears and talk about what 3 Mile Island meant in terms of nuclear power's place in power markets in the U.S. I've already said we never shut down all of the reactors, and eventually we did resume licensing the plants that were waiting in line for licenses. But at the same time, the U.S. Congress and in the U.S. the economics of utility power supply are regulated state by state. many states essentially said, from now on we want to do things differently. We're not satisfied with the paradigm in which the utilities own the generation and the transmission and the distribution. We want to, power sector language, the word is liberalize, but really, lay terms, just as easily say break up this arrangement. We don't want generation to be a monopoly anymore. We want to let non-utility companies build power plants. We want to let new technologies into this mixture, energy efficiency, renewable energy, advanced types of gas. We basically just want competition to push this market and to make its way into what gets chosen, instead of a few people in a closed room saying, we think the next plant should be coal, or we think the next plant should be nuclear. We're going to say, we need 5,000 megawatts by, to put it in today's terms, 2020 or 2025. Who wants to supply it, and what will the price be? And that led to a very different world. Different companies began to build power plants, different technologies began to meet the needs, and at least in many parts of the U.S., some stayed with the old system, but in many parts of the U.S., the system evolved to one in which the power supply no longer depended on utilities and the bureaucracy, but became much more of a commodity-driven, market-driven process in which no one really knew what would be supplying the power in 2025 or 2030 until they asked and found out who was prepared to supply it and on what terms. And I have to say again and again, as the utilities conducted these auctions, they got pleasant surprises. They got pleasant surprises in terms of price, in terms of technology, and in terms of quantity. At first, the utilities were very resistant. They said this isn't going to work. The new companies won't be reliable suppliers. The new technologies won't work as well as the old ones. It won't be financeable. And there'll be dangers of blackouts and brownouts. In fact, we wound up getting offers 5 and 10 times what were being solicited, and the prices generally were lower than what was expected. Now, I can't sit here and tell you the same thing would happen in Japan, but I can tell you you won't find out until you ask Japan. That's the way markets work, and it's the way they work in Europe as well as in the US. What has not thrived in these new markets is new nuclear reactors. No new nuclear reactor has ever been successfully in a power market anywhere in the world. And the fundamental reason for that is that these markets have the effect of shifting economic risk from the customers who bear the risk under the vertically integrated system that still exists in some parts of the world, largely still exists in Japan. The customers bear the risks. If there's a cost overrun or poor operation, one way or another, it will show up in the rates, or conceivably, if the government pays a subsidy, taxpayers will bear the risk. But under the power market situation, where the company bids, signs a contract, the market continues to solicit electricity and bases its prices on the bids that it gets, the investors are the ones who take the risk. Now, under the old system, the investor's profit is limited, so there's some justification for limiting their risk. But under the market system, the profit isn't limited, and the risk isn't limited either. You can go broke. And potential investors won't build new reactors under that framework. There are too many things that can go wrong. Too much money is required per plant. plant, and too much time goes by between the time you start to build and the time you can actually earn a return. So what we've seen in Europe and in the US in the last couple of decades is a system in which the markets keep producing smaller, more flexible solutions, often renewable, often energy efficiency. In the US lately, often natural gas, because it's become so cheap and because it pairs up well with renewable energy. So on the one hand, decisions about nuclear power are perhaps seen as being independent of decisions about what to do about power markets, and to some extent they are, especially in the situation where the 50 plants are shut down. On the other hand, in the not so long run, there will be an interrelationship between what a country does about its power procurement process, whether it opens it up to competition, and what will happen to its nuclear fleet. In the US again, in the last year, actually 5 of our 104 operating reactors have announced that they'll close because their future operation is just too expensive compared to the prices being, the cost of generating electricity in other ways. Now the other 99 plants intend to continue operating, so who knows whether this is a long-term trend or not. But it is important to understand that there is a connection, will be a connection between power market developments and nuclear developments. But that by and large in our experience, the surprises you get from the power markets are a lot happier than the surprises that you get from nuclear energy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Bradford, for a very interesting and enlightening speech. We'll go to questions now. The working press first. Please go up to the mic, state your name and affiliation if you have one, and keep your questions as short as possible. Who wants to ask a question? Okay.
My name is Crowell. I'm with Nuclear Intelligence Weekly in the U.S. There have been three...
My favorite trade publication.
three investigations into the Fukushima, 2 by the government, 1 by a private entity. And the last ones were revealed more than a year ago, I think. And some of them can't make judgments on certain critical items like whether the nuclear plants were fatally damaged by the earthquake as opposed to and so on. Do these investigations take place too soon, in your opinion?
I can't say they took place too soon.
In terms of the general interest in understanding the accident, I think I mentioned it was 5 years before we knew what the extent of the fuel damage at 3 Mile Island. So all of the studies done in the first year or 2 afterwards got that wrong. They all thought there had been some fuel damage, but nothing like as much as had actually occurred. The Fukushima accident is an accident of longer duration. In fact, in some ways, it continues. Not obviously with the severity of the first month, but in terms of some things being unknown and some things being out of control. So to try to do a study that would be conclusive as to all the effects, yeah, I don't see how one could have expected to do that. And my assumption is that the people who did those studies didn't expect to be the last word on those subjects either. I mean, there was just too much in flux. One of the problems we had at 3 Mile Island was that there wasn't a lot of instrumentation around the plant or in the plant that was terribly useful. The instrumentation had been set up with the assumption that accidents would never happen. And so, for example, temperature gauges didn't read above 600 degrees, even though the actual temperature during the accident got up to 2,500. But why have a thermometer that would go there if it was never going to happen? Off-site radiation monitoring the same way. At Fukushima, years later, it was understood that these things could happen because they had at 3 Mile Island, they had in Chernobyl. But a lot of the instrumentation required electric power. And when the electric power was lost, we wind up really no better off than we were after 3 Mile Island. The instruments were there, but they couldn't read or couldn't transmit. So the processes of figuring out a lot that happened during that accident are still going to take some time. The other issue that's raised by those studies, and I dare say you all are more familiar than I, is what level of access you have to the backup information. To the extent you have questions about them or questions about other areas that they didn't go into, do you have access to anything like those recordings of commissioners' discussions? My understanding, just anecdotal, is you probably don't. TEPCO has occasionally allowed people to come to its headquarters for an hour or two and watch a video or take a note, but the documents just don't get released.
Question. Okay.
Hi, Eric Slavin with Stars and Stripes. I'm just curious, when you first saw Fukushima unfolding, was your response something to the effect of, did these guys learn anything from what we went through back during 3 Mile Island?
It's a great question.
We're actually just talking a little about it at lunch. When I first saw on television that there had been an earthquake and a tsunami in Japan, the press account just happened to mention that there had been also an evacuation ordered for, I think, a 2-kilometer area around Fukushima. It wasn't a big deal in the news account, but to me, it was as alarming as anything else I heard, because I knew from my own experience how reluctant nuclear regulators are to have the word evacuation associated with nuclear power. And I knew even more than that, that with the combination of the tsunami and the earthquake, you wouldn't want to evacuate people if you could help it, because why would you want suddenly to, first of all, when you recommend evacuation, a lot more people move than the ones just within the 2 kilometers. So why would you want to put people on the highways under the conditions prevailing after the earthquake if you could possibly help it? So to me, the situation kind of screamed, this must be much more dangerous than the media's understanding it to be. And I wonder whether the government has the level of communication with us, all the things that we didn't have at 3 Mile Island. I wondered whether they existed. But at the same time, for that first week, I felt I really had to suspend judgment, because during the 3 Mile Island accident, we didn't have an earthquake and a tsunami to cope with. So while it was obvious that there were some high degrees of confusion and a lack of information, it was also quite understandable that that would be the case. The instrumentation might be a lot better, but the conditions were inevitably so much worse that
as events unfolded beyond that, I guess I did begin to wonder about the levels of transparency and information that were being given to the public, not necessarily in quite the terms you suggested. I mean, 3 Mile Island had been a long time ago. I didn't expect there was anyone in the government immediately familiar with it. There probably weren't even that many people left at our Nuclear Regulatory Commission who were familiar with it in detail. But it has seemed to me, as the weeks and months have gone by, that at least as to the processes of transparency and public involvement, well, it's a different country, the traditions are different, but there's a lot I would have done differently.
Producer freelance from Germany. We in Germany were very much affected by the Chernobyl incident because that was geographically close by. We had, of course, effects to this day on people individually who got radiation, for instance, children, etc. We have had a very lively debate in Germany even before that, but even after that, of course, increasingly. Now in Japan, that incident was far away and it didn't cause anything. And the whole system here is built on a basic policy decision: nuclear energy is safe. Mr. Eisenhower, many years ago, had this story about atoms for peace, etc. And the Japanese took it on in policy from the government, and the media joined in and they got big advertising, etc. And all the people involved with it were somehow supportive of it. And the anti-movement didn't exist or was not in any way, shall we say, made it a public affair. That's a very recent thing. My question to you is, was there no such effort in the US to hide the stuff, the dangers, and to create supportive movement in public and in the authorities and get the politicians in this or that direction? For instance, with money paid for exercises or scientific research trips or whatever, or advertisements paid for the newspapers, etc., to line them all up. There's practically no one of the regular big papers that had an anti-nuclear policy here. Nothing like that in the US? Could you describe that situation?
There certainly, over decades, has been a campaign on the part of the nuclear industry in the US to portray nuclear energy as safe, as being the answer to oil dependency, being necessary to avoid blackouts, as being the answer to climate change. And it includes many of the techniques that you mentioned. There's also been a substantial push from the other direction, though, from environmental organizations skeptical of nuclear energy, from people in the Congress and the state legislatures holding hearings into various events that have gone wrong, not just 3 Mile Island, but the fire at Browns Ferry and the cost overruns. So perhaps because the U.S. NGO community is different than the one in Japan, perhaps because some of the media has been more aggressive, but also has more information to work with. I mean, our regulatory authorities, both economic and safety, have their flaws, but between the Freedom of Information Act and the Sunshine Law, they do have access to probably more information than any other large country, certainly. I think more than Russia, China, India, probably Japan. I don't know about Canada. So they've had much more to work with and push back with. So the answer to your question, short answer is yes, the campaign has existed in the U.S. as well, but there's been more pushback.
Thank you. Joël Lejean from RTL France Broadcasting. Yeah, the question is about transparency in the nuclear industry. I mean, you emphasize this issue. My question would be how to make it a circle of virtue, something virtuous. It's virtue. How can we come to this? You said by competition. Is it enough? And is there something else, such as a legal system, a legal framework, an obligation? Something that is not just a fight from NGOs who have to go to the parliament and strike everyone, or media being attacked by anti-nuclear saying, you don't do your job. What could be done to give more transparency to this industry beyond the implication of the nuclear industry and the consequences for nuclear military forces?
Well, you're certainly correct that it isn't just a sort of generalized policy of market-based or competition. I mean, that policy is only going to be effective if it's within a legal framework that assures equality of access to the transmission lines, that assures that all sources have equal access to the market and reflect the actual values that they convey, and that the information about prices, safety issues is available. So there's a framework of legal changes that goes with the market development. It's more like a chain than a single policy change. If you don't have the laws, don't have the budget, don't have the competitors, in the end you don't get from here to there. I guess I should say, since I'm actually here because I've been speaking at a conference at the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation that's still going on, cover the conference and you'll get a sense of the different technologies and possibilities that are available, and also the kinds of legislative and policy changes that it takes to bring them into being. Nathan can tell you where.
1, 2, 3.
Siegfried Hitler, freelancer from Germany. Two questions to the nuclear security. One is in Japan they have in some places 4, 5 or 6 or 7 reactors at one place. Would it be possible under American rules or regulations to have so many reactors at one place? And the other one about earthquake security. I think many places in Japan are very not safe for to build a nuclear power plant. Perhaps researchers now are looking for active and non-active fault, but it's very difficult to say what's active and non-active. So now also on American rules, would it be possible to have a power plant at such in a place if nobody knows is a fault active or non-active?
Well, first of all, I stopped being a nuclear regulator a long time ago, so my detailed familiarity with today's seismic rules is nothing you want to largest site we have had is 3. And there's one site now where 2 more are being built and 2 exist, so that will be a 4-reactor site. Since no one is proposing any more at the moment, I think 4 is as high as we're going to go, and questions like 6 or 7 just aren't going to arise. I'm sure if that is proposed, there will be challenges based on what happened in Fukushima, but I can't tell you what the outcome will be. In the U.S., half of the plants that were ever proposed were canceled, and if they'd all been built, there might be a 5-reactor site out there somewhere. I just don't remember. We've been challenged by seismic standards, just as you described, particularly at the Diablo Canyon site in California, where a fault was discovered while the plant was being built. Questions arose as to its activity. Plant builders came back in and redesigned all their seismic equipment and said that they had strengthened it to the point where it could withstand the maximum earthquake. It's never been tested, of course. The question's now coming up because as Diablo Canyon progresses in its license life, the owners are having to decide whether they're going to seek a 20-year extension. And we know a lot more now than we did then about seismic impact. So that will be a heavily litigated proceeding. We'll know more when it's over. But the U.S. has a lot of areas where the seismicity is not what it is in Japan, and that's where most of the reactors are. On the other hand, they're designed to lower standards, so if we actually had an earthquake well beyond the design basis, even in the East, I think we can't be sure what the impacts would be.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter Fuchs with Tokyo Investment Research. I cover Japanese markets for global investors. I wonder if I can get your thought on the following, that the zero nuke campaign, it might be a dangerous red herring. And what I mean by that is looking at possible worst scenarios involving Fukushima Daiichi and the decommissioning process of 25 years versus some sort of partial restart of some of the other nukes. And Japanese public opinion in a recent study said that 30 to 40 would prefer a partial restart with a finite schedule. But what I'm getting at is that the total risk of any of the other nuclear power plants in Japan being restarted and operating versus the somewhat under-stressed risk that still continues up at the Fukushima decommissioning site, where you have tanks of water that are incredibly unstable. You have the removal of spent fuel rods from building 4, which is a protracted and also quite hazardous process. And then the future opening up of these things, and let's hope that they don't go, sort of melt out of the containment chamber. Don't you think that there's somehow a disconnect in the public mind between the total risk of all the others that are still intact and safe versus this kind of potentially explosive mixture of the decommissioning process? Does that make sense? Are people underestimating still the Daiichi problems?
I don't know how to answer that, because I don't live in Japan and don't have to think in those terms all the time. In my own experience, different people have such different tolerances for different kinds of risk that it's very hard to the point of impossible to speak generally about sort of an overall societal tolerance. I mean, you can get risk assessment specialists who will compare the risks of the 50 plants to the risks of Fukushima.
Fukushima and tell you that one is more dangerous than the other. It wouldn't surprise me to find that they would rather live near any of the other plants than live near Fukushima, but I just don't feel as though I can say anything meaningful about the calculation a person who actually lives near a different plant might make about the risk. To them, the risk of having that plant turned on might seem greater than the risk of Fukushima some distance away. Certainly, I found that a lot in the U.S. The plant that worried the person was the one they lived close to.
We're running out of time. Question before over here.
I saw a picture of the 30-meter
Can you
high.
state your name?
My name is Inamura Associate. I saw a picture in which a 30-meter high tidal wave was attacking the Fukushima Daiichi. I thought it was almost going to be the end of the world. But my question is that why Fukushima Daiichi was so much constructed so close to the beaches without any care to the seismological tidal wave attack. The second question is that are there some American people who are involved in the construction work of the Fukushima Daiichi? Because somebody else already commented that there was a strong voice of the atomic for peace. Then it was so constructed without any factors paying attention to the seismic or tidal wave attack, as if it was constructed on the desert to bring in the nuclear fuels. What do you think?
No, I don't know much about the history of construction of that plant. It's a General Electric boiling water reactor design, and at that time, General Electric was a U.S. company, so it would not surprise me to find that U.S. personnel were involved in the sale of the reactor, and to some extent in the design and the construction, but I just don't know. As to the standards that allowed it to be built, I really know nothing at all. I know that in the investigations of our own accident at 3 Mile Island, which happened 7 years after Fukushima came into service, the conclusion was that the nuclear industry in the U.S. suffered from a mindset of believing that accidents simply would not happen. And that showed up in any number of ways, from the shortcomings in emergency planning to the instruments that I mentioned earlier that couldn't read above normal, to the disbelief of the operators when they were confronted by accident conditions. So it's not inconceivable that the same kind of an outlook would have affected choices about plant location and how high the walls had to be, but I just don't have first-hand knowledge of that.
Okay, just two questions. I don't think we don't have much time. We have one writing question from Calder Nazari, a well-known Syrian journalist here. And he asked, what do you think about Japan actually exporting nuclear facilities to other countries?
I think it really, the safety of reactors doesn't depend very heavily on the country of origin. It depends on the strength of the standards in the country that's building them, whether the regulators are well trained and the industry has a good safety culture. It depends also, in some situations, of course, on the proliferation concerns and the
agreements for cooperation, whether there's an accompanying commitment to proliferation resistant or proliferation compatible technologies, but really not that much seems to me to depend on the country of origin. I'm okay.
Langdon from Bloomberg News. If you take a look at the three main civil nuclear accidents we've had, 3 Mile, Chernobyl, and then Fukushima, one could say they're getting progressively worse. I mean, Chernobyl was bigger in terms of it blew up into the atmosphere, but you know, it has been put that Fukushima has gone down, as it were. It's still bleeding into the ocean with radiation and so on. So it's raised the question that should there be some form of either UN body or military scale style body to respond to these accidents, because the very nature of them is they're international. They affect other countries, and as we've seen, they're very difficult to deal with. Do you have any view on that, or have you ever heard of any discussions of that taking place anywhere? Thank you.
If nothing else, I'd certainly heard it on television during the Fukushima accident. We had one particularly over-the-top commentator on CNN in the US who kept saying, I don't understand why the International Atomic Energy Agency isn't taking over. Well, the answer's, I think, pretty straightforward. It's a terrible idea. You can't send an emergency team in. And I don't at all mean to insult your intelligence in asking the question. It's a perfectly legitimate, plausible question. But you can't send a SWAT team into a specific nuclear plant that hasn't trained on that specific plant, and especially the older units built at a time when there was a lot of difference from one unit to another, and the industry was still groping toward what features to standardize around. There's just no way that a team of even boiling water reactor experts from another country or a military background would hope to do a better job than the people who do the plant. There's a slightly different and more troublesome question that I think Fukushima almost posed, which is what happens if the people don't want to stay. And how do you make sure somebody actually does stay and operate the plant? But the answer isn't going to be fly them in from Geneva.
Next is Edwin.
Edwin Carmiel, freelance. This may be a repeated. Do you believe that if Japan would have immediately accepted the overseas, the assistance of the overseas nuclear experts, the meltdown and other after effects could have been averted? I also point that TEPCO did not, the maintenance was very bad.
I haven't heard that there were a lot of good ideas floating around, say at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the U.S. that would have changed the course of the accident, but I'm probably not the right person to give you a good answer to that question. I know Greg Jacksko, who was the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at that time, is going to be in Japan during the March 11th commemorations, and he'd be a better person to ask.
my sense is that once that accident was underway, there wasn't a lot that could have been done to keep the, well, I shouldn't say that. There were things that could have been done to improve the situation, but there's no assurance that foreign experts would have thought of them any more than the Japanese plant operators did.
We have one final question, Jimbo at the back.
Well, I'm Teddy Jimbo with the Video News. Two quick questions. One is do you think Japan is fit, or a seismic country like Japan is fit to operate a nuclear plant? That's question number one. Number two is one of the unspoken secret about the Japanese nuclear program is that even if it wants to stop running a nuclear plant, it can't, have no choice, because right now about $15 billion worth of spent nuclear fuel is registered as an asset by power companies, because they're supposed to be used as a fuel again. But once the program is stopped, it will be registered as the liability, and it's big enough to send all the power companies insolvent. Of course, another is 17,000 tons of spent fuel, which is now stored in interim storage site in Aomori. It has to be sent back to each nuclear power plant, but there's no space for storage. So for those two reasons, the government doesn't really have a choice but to just keep on running. As a law expert, do you have any advice or any thought on the situation Japan is stuck with now?
Well, first of all, as to the seismicity issues, I just don't know. That's a question for people with a different skill set than I have. And in a way, the best answer to your second question is probably that I don't know either. But you know, we do have some experience, nothing like the situation the Japanese face now, but some experience in the U.S. and in other countries with decisions to step back from either particular nuclear plants or, in Germany's case, a lot of nuclear capacity. And you know, yes, it's certainly difficult, potentially expensive, but there are different ways to do it too. It can be done in steps. Done in phases, and I don't know, for example, what kind of reserves have been built up to deal with spent fuel, with decommissioning. If those reserves don't exist, it's probably time to start building them, because that's something that in the U.S. system we began charging customers for back in the early 1980s, and we may not have enough money built up. That remains to be seen, but we do have two pretty big sets of funds, one for spent fuel and one for decommissioning today.
Okay, I'm sorry, we have to leave things there as we have another press conference coming up.
Excuse me again, Joël. Jean, I agree with what you say on many points, but as far as I remember, in 2001, the Supreme Court of the United States has denied any a positive answer to the people who have sued. There were thousands of people living here at 3 Mile Island who have asked compensations, as we have here in Tokyo with Fukushima also. But in 2001, I think the Supreme Court has decided that there would be no no way for them to have satisfaction. So here is the question again. Why is it that we try to preserve an industry more than the people?
Well, I am not familiar with that decision, but I do know that something on the order of $100 to $150 million was paid in compensation after the accident at 3 Mile Island. It's another area in which U.S. law requires the building up of a fund and the maintaining of, well, there are several layers, but the private operator has to have $300 million, and then the industry as a whole has to build an amount up to $12 billion. So it's not enough by any means to cover Fukushima, but it did make some payments after 3 Mile Island. If I knew anything about that Supreme Court case, I could give you a more coherent answer, but it's not correct to say that no damages were paid.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bradford. And I'd like to give a warm thanks to our guest today for a very enlightening And as a token of our appreciation, we will give Professor Bradford a 1-year honorary membership to the club. Thank you very much. Thank you.
はい、お待ちください。